Our next speaker is Peter Young. He is a voice for creative and often controversial tactics to achieve animal liberation. In his talk today, Peter will give us an insider's perspective on government repression, the facts, the myth, understanding the psychology of fear, and why the best defense is a good offense. Welcome, Peter Young.
Thank you. I think we have Luxembourg Television is here, the national TV station somewhere. Hello to them. So I'll tell you just a real short story. I got involved in a legal issue some years ago where I was charged with some crimes, and I chose to become a fugitive at the time rather than face a possible life sentence in prison. And I went on the run, and I was away from the movement in a visible sense, at least, for about 8 years. I got arrested. I went to prison for 2 years. So there was a big gap of time, about 10 years, where in a lot of ways I was not... it was sort of like, almost like I got sucked up into a spaceship for 10 years and then dropped off in 2007. In terms of, although I had activist friends that I was in touch with to a limited extent during that time, and I was in touch with the animal rights movement through the internet and so forth, I wasn't so much in touch with the day-to-day conversation of the animal rights movement for a large gap of time. I couldn't go to protests. I was hiding out from the police. There were a lot of activities I could not participate in. So when I got out of prison, sometimes I would get invited to speak places, and I would always ask, as a courtesy to the people who invited me, I would say, what would you like me to speak about? And when I was involved for the first several years I was involved before I went on the run, I would go see speakers, and I was always interested in give me some useful information that I could take back out into my activism and use to help animals. That's always what I wanted out of a speaker. So when I got out of prison, I thought it was really weird because I would always ask, what would you like me to speak about? And I heard 100% of the time, repression, repression, repression. They always wanted me to talk about government repression. And it was just repression, repression, repression. And to me, kind of getting sucked up in that spaceship and dropped off 10 years later, that was really weird. And I don't remember the climate being such that repression was we were so obsessed with it. And so I would always give it, I'd always sort of, again, as a courtesy, I would talk about government repression, about my experiences, about, whether it was prison or the various things that I'd gone through. And I was never really comfortable with it. I sort of did it as an obligation to the people that asked me to speak because, they were my hosts. And so I was sort of say what they wanted me to say. Well, one time I was given a speech of a talk that I gave after giving these speeches for about 2 years, and I listened to this tape, and I would talk about things that I thought were useful and maybe tactics that would help activists and things that I thought maybe hopefully people could use to help animals. And then it was almost like during the speech you could hear me turn the page to the part about government repression, and my voice went flat, and I said, and now I'm going to talk about government repression. And it was like all the passion went out of my voice, and as soon as I heard that, I realized I was not acting consistently with my core principles. I was actually acting in conflict with my mission as a speaker, which was to hopefully help people help animals. And I realized that not only was I not acting consistently with my core principles, I was actually acting in direct conflict with them, because through the conversation about repression and the talks I was giving about repression, I feel like, and I knew this on some level, that I was actually just spreading fear. It was not helpful for animals. It was not helpful for activists. It was actually the opposite of that. So I stopped talking about repression, and I pretty much refused to talk about it. I didn't think it was helpful to animals. And then I met Fabian, one of the organizers here in Los Angeles at a conference it was like last month. And she said, we really want you to come talk about repression. And I said, oh man. I said, I really want to go to Luxembourg, but I don't know if I want to talk about that. So I said, okay, but in my hidden agenda is actually to sort of hijack this talk. I'm not going to talk about repression. I am going to talk about repression, but I'm going to talk about it in a way that might be, maybe a little actually unpopular, but definitely not what I was invited to talk about. So what I want to talk about is the conversation about repression that we have currently. Now, I would much rather, as I said, give something, give you hopefully something actionable or useful you can use to go out and help animals than tell you, what hole you should hide in to protect yourself from like the government boogeyman. That's, I think, the obligation of anybody who's, on a stage or at a podium or what have you. So I'm not going to talk about repression. I'm going to talk about how we respond to repression, because I think that might actually be useful. And I should mention this, that what I'm speaking about may not be entirely relevant to everybody in this room, because I'm just speaking about my experiences where I come from. In the United States, the conversation about repression has become huge. It's become very fashionable. It's become, as I said, it's just repression, 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 and it has overshadowed the actual conversation about what we can do to help animals, which is the most important conversation we can have. So if you come from a country where that is not the case, hopefully this can serve as sort of a cautionary tale about what might happen if you allow that conversation to take hold and paralyze people with fear, because that's what I've seen in the United States, is a lot of people are paralyzed by fear. So the core of my talk, I should get that out of the way, is not going to be what I just said. It's going to be a list of a short account of my experiences with government repression, whether it's prison or getting my house raided or finding out a girl that I was dating was working for the FBI. Certain things like that. I want to kind of walk you through some of my experiences, because I kind of feel like I've experienced it from all sides. So that's going to come at the end, but just real quickly, I want to get some stuff out of the way. The narrative in the United States right now about government repression sort of goes like this. Someday in the near future, we're all going to go to prison as terrorists for the rest of our lives for passing out vegan literature, okay? Now, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but that's sort of how the conversation has been twisted in the US. So you have a lot of people that are afraid to do even the most minimal level of activism because they're afraid of going to prison. That's what it's come to. And I think that's obviously extremely dangerous. And there's certain people who really want the conversation about repression to go like this. They want to take the worst examples of government repression, give a disproportionate amount of attention to those examples, and then embrace a sort of crippling fear is the only natural response. You're not going to hear that from me. I reject that conversation entirely. I think it's extremely dangerous. And that's kind of actually why I wanted to give this talk. So, where I come from in the U.S., repression, the subject, has become very, very cool and trendy. And I would like to personally, I like to make activism for animals cool and trendy. Hopefully, in sort of trying to challenge this conversation, maybe we can make that happen together. By the way, I have to say this. I don't mean to single out anybody individually or groups. I don't think the people that necessarily oftentimes will talk about repression and focus on it, I don't think they're ill-intentioned most of the time. It doesn't make them any less dangerous. And I'm certainly not talking about anybody who addresses the conversation about government repression in a very sober way, in an analytical way. I'm not talking about journalists, people of this sort. I'm talking about a certain segment of the movement, most of whom are not even activists, who focus entirely on spreading fear through talking about repression. But strangely, when it's time to actually put work in for animals, they're nowhere to be found. And you see a lot of these people, it's very unfortunate because it's become such a fashionable subject. So we have to ask ourselves, whose interest does this serve, this conversation about government repression? You always have to think about your outcome. So what is the intention when we talk about government repression? Are we just trying to make ourselves feel like we're part of some cool action movie, or is this actually useful? Is this repression that we're so afraid of actually an obstacle in helping animals, or is it something that's just in our heads? And it's something we really have to look at. So I think it's getting worse. Now, when I got involved in activism, people would get arrested sometimes. That would happen. And we supported those people. We stepped up to support people who got arrested for ALF actions and so forth. And that's very, very important. Obviously, I was the recipient of a large amount of prisoner support, and I'm very grateful for that. So I'm not talking about that. But we never lost our focus. We would help people who needed help in prison, but our focus was always on the animals. And I think we've gotten away from that a little bit. And now I feel like there are, and I saw a little bit of this myself, people who are in prison whose cases are sort of exploited to drum up fear. oftentimes without the sort of support of those actual prisoners. You know, I know for a fact there's people right now who don't in prison at this moment who do not like the way their cases are being used to sort of drum up fear and to say, look at what can happen if you go out and break the law for animals. They never really talk about how the fact that like almost nobody gets caught for breaking the law to help animals. That conversation never seems to happen. I know when I was in prison, I was the way that my case was portrayed was that I was looking at 82 years in prison, which on paper was true. Practically speaking, I would not have gotten 82 years. But people like to take the worst case scenario and highlight that. And in fact, even after I got 2 years in prison, people still said, well, he could have gotten 82 years in prison. Like, what's the point in focusing on that? You understand what I'm saying? Like, whose interest does it serve? So, I was in an interesting situation. Like, I was a few years ago. I was at a conference, and it was a unique situation where there were 3 people in the room who had all been charged with animal enterprise terrorism. Now, this is a charge, and it became it's also a law, the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. But this is a law that is most of the focus of the conversation in my country about repression. It's the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. It's going to criminalize, vegan leafleting, and we're all going to prison as terrorists. I mean, some people actually, really are genuinely like believe this. And I was in this room, and there was a speaker who had been charged with animal enterprise terrorism, who said, and this is a room of probably about this size, a couple hundred activists, and the person said, "How many people in this room are afraid of the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act?" And every single hand in the room went up. Almost every single hand. And then the person said, okay, now how many people in this room who have been charged with animal enterprise terrorism are afraid of the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act? And there happened to be 3 people in the room who have been charged, myself included, who have been charged with animal enterprise terrorism, and none of us raised our hands. Now, that does not mean we're brave or we're courageous. It doesn't mean anything like that. What it means is that we have seen the threat close up, and we have demystified it, and we understand it. We don't just look at it in terms of the sort of the reputation of it, but we look at the actual threat itself, and we have a more sober analysis because we've seen it close up. So the point of that is that the people who fear government repression the most, strangely, seem to be the people who are on the sidelines, oftentimes not even activists, and are not the people actually putting in work. Because if you're putting in work, generally you're going to be more focused on your goal than you are in helping animals than you are with some distant threat in the distance. And we can sort of look at this by looking at the numbers, just the raw data here. Now, in my estimation, in the United States, there's probably fewer than, I'm very generous here, but there's probably fewer than like 15 organizers in the United States who are legal organizers who are so effective that they actually have reason to fear something like the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. And I would say actually that number is probably even like less than 10 or maybe even less than 5 in the United States. So the point is that the conversation, and you hear about the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act all day long in the United States, and the conversation is not scaled to the actual number of people that actually have a legitimate reason to fear being prosecuted by it. It's not to say that it's not a real thing. It's not to say that it does not give out larger sentences to people than they otherwise would have received. I don't mean to diminish the actual threat, but the point of this conversation is that we should actually look at the true threat, not just the fear that it spreads, and that's what I think is most dangerous. There's probably fewer in the US, probably fewer than 20 people who have carried out Animal Liberation Front actions who have not been arrested and for whom they could still actually be charged, who may actually have something to fear from the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. So on the maximum end in the country, by my, to be fair, by my estimation, there's probably fewer than 40 people in the United States who actually legitimately have something to fear from the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. However, this conversation in the AETA is discussed by nearly all activists almost constantly. And I find it disempowering, and that's why I don't like that conversation. And that's why I think we should start to scale the conversation to the true threat and not the perceived threat. So, did anyone see, I hope everyone saw Jorge from Brazil speak yesterday, and he said something I thought was just amazing, and it really highlights how much privilege goes into this conversation about repression. He was talking about how in Brazil, they had this raid of a lab, and there were 200 beagles taken from this lab, and it was just like this awesome story. I hope everyone saw that. And he was saying in Brazil, people who break into buildings to rescue animals, they do not fear going to prison. They fear getting shot and killed while they're carrying out these actions. Because although there is a lot of guns in the United States, apparently actually getting shot while you're committing a crime is a much more realistic threat in Brazil than it is in my country. And I think that really puts things in perspective. There are people doing things who very legitimately have reason to fear being shot and killed by security guards or people in these businesses who still do them. And in my country, where that actually really is not a very realistic threat, we are just paralyzed by fear of the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. Not to mention the fact that in Brazil, 90% of the people in prison have HIV, and gang rape is rampant, and going to prison is like possibly a literal death sentence. Whereas in my country, the prisons are like basically a joke most of the time. So there's so much privilege that goes into this conversation. So the last point I want to make before I get to talking about some of my personal experiences with what we call repression, is this concept that I would like everyone to hopefully think about of the cop that exists in your head. I have dealt with a lot of police in my life. I think a lot of us in this room have, certainly people, I'm sure, more than myself. But the cop I'm afraid of most is that cop that exists in my head. And these are the cops, that's that voice in your head that tells you, that you should, scale back your activism to be totally sure that you never go to prison. The cop in your head is that little voice that tells you, to keep a low profile so you don't get put on like some terrorist like watch list or something. The cop in your head is that one that tells you that anytime you break some law, whether it's minor or major, that you're going to go to prison, that you're going to get caught and go to prison. And that cop in your head is the one that sort of makes you feel like there's some grand conspiracy to put you in prison for the rest of your life. And I think on some level, even though that might be kind of an exaggeration for almost all of us, but on some level, I think we all have that cop in our head that tells us to sort of like, pull it back, like don't be so extreme, don't do as much, like be cautious, maybe you go to prison, like be careful. And in the United States, that is a very real thing. I mean, you can almost hear people's thoughts sometimes in that cop that exists in people's heads. So what's really important, and I've had to struggle with this myself a lot to this day even, is to identify that voice, identify that cop in your head, and just like kill that cop. Like don't let it speak. Because if you think about it, like we speak to ourselves in ways we would never let anyone else speak to us. Can you imagine if somebody came up to you and said, oh, don't do that thing, like you're too weak to handle a weekend in jail. Or somebody came up to you and said, you don't have the courage to deal like with interacting with police, so don't do anything that might invite a police interaction. You'd want to like fight that person. I wouldn't let anyone say that to me. But we talk to ourselves that way all day long with our activism. I could probably talk for a very long time about this. I was going to kind of go into like the psychology of like repression obsession, and sort of like my analysis is that I think people like to feel like there is an enemy that they're fighting, or somehow that there's they're so much of a threat that they would actually fear. They actually have something to fear from repression. We all do on some level, but not to the degree that we talk about it. It's almost like, it's like playing a video game. Like it's not really fun if nobody's like shooting back at you. So in some weird way, I think we get some like psychological satisfaction about feeling like we are being repressed when there really is no government repression. We have no evidence that actually happening to us. So I hope I've kind of at least like tried to, maybe just kind of help the conversation be a little bit more empowering. I'm not saying we shouldn't talk about it, but I'm saying when we do talk about it, we should at least like sort of put it to a little test. And the one thing I think we should do if we ever talk about repression, let's at least ask ourselves this question: what is our intention? If you're going to write an article, if you're going to do a workshop, if you're going to give a speech, you always have to ask, what is your intention behind talking about repression? There's a lot of things that I personally could say about prison that I won't talk about, because I ask myself, whose interest will it serve if I talk about like this bad thing that happened to me in prison? Okay, that serves the interest of the animal abusers. Okay, all it does is serve to instill fear in people. So anytime we have this conversation, I think we should ask ourselves, what is our intention? And also, is this repression that we're talking about actually a legitimate roadblock to our activism, or is it just a perceived obstacle? Do you understand the distinction? Like, there's a lot of things, there's a big gap between the perceived threat and the actual threat. And that could be in almost everything you do in life, especially in this conversation that we have about government repression. So, let me kind of go into, see, I talked about the cop in our heads, and that's the most dangerous cop of all. And so now, let me just go into a little bit about some of the stuff I've experienced, and the point of this, because it could very easily go two ways. When people talk about, getting their house raided and being interrogated by the FBI, it's very easy for people to take from that some fear. You could leave this room with some fear. What I would like, my intention here is to show you that these things that we fear oftentimes are almost never as bad close up as they are from a distance. And that's true of all things in life. You can think about people say like speaking in public is the most scary thing that there is. And, usually if you get put in a situation where you have to do it, it ends up being not as bad as you thought it was. So I think the repression I've experienced has definitely fallen in that category. It's much more scary from a distance than it is when I actually see it close up. So I hope that is the sort of the takeaway message that I can leave. So when I first got involved in activism, there was a big conversation going on. I remember this was in Seattle in the United States, and people were talking a lot about the fear of like surveillance from the government. And I thought, that's kind of weird because I've never actually seen any evidence of this. And so I was a little bit suspicious that, is this people who just kind of feel like maybe like a little self-important, like they want to sort of feel like they're being watched, or is this actually a legitimate concern? Well, one day I was I got a summons to appear in court, and I showed up in court, and I was told I was being charged with vandalizing a street sign, and I was being charged with like taking a pen, and I don't know how it is here, but like in the United States, if you want to cross the street, there's like a little sign that just has a person walking across the street. So I took a pen and drew a skateboard under the person on the sign, just for no reason, because it was like midnight, and I thought it'd be funny. And well, so as it turns out, I was getting charged with this, and my thought was, how did they know? I was careful to make sure no one was watching me. Well, as it turns out, I was being followed. Actually, my friend's whose house I was leaving, the sign was outside of his house. His house was being staked out by the police because they were investigating some vandalism that had happened around the Seattle area. It was like butcher shops, getting their windows broken and stuff like that. And so they thought me or him were involved, so they were following him and following me. And now, that could actually be something that could be pretty intimidating. You think about, wow, the cops are following me. The fact that I only got charged with vandalizing a street sign told me that they're really, really bad at their job, because I was out vandalizing shit like every goddamn night. So the fact that I took this as a very like empowering thing, because my thought was, well, all they know about is a street sign. That means they're really not doing a very thorough job of putting me under surveillance. So that was my first sign that they're really not very good at what they do. And I think you'll see that pattern kind of emerge as I go through some of these examples, is that they're kind of like Keystone Cops. Is that a term that people know? Keystone Cops, like really stupid cops. Let's just say stupid cop. So stupid cops, and that's been my experience time and time again. Now, I have to say this up front. Like there's a big difference between like an investigation for like releasing mink at a fur farm and like something like the Shack case or like an arson. Okay, so I don't mean to put myself in that category, but almost every time I have looked at like police investigative techniques or the things, their spying techniques, I find that it's like mostly just a really bad joke. Like they're just like really bad at what they do. So You'll see that pattern emerge as I keep talking. But so I shortly after that, it was like maybe a month or two after that incident, after I got charged with the vandalism, I had my house raided, and I was actually living in I guess you call it a squat, like an abandoned house, in this pretty rich neighborhood outside Seattle. And me and some activist friends lived in this squat, and so the police raided the house. And strangely, it got a little bit of media attention. There was like a couple of newspaper articles, and the headlines read like "Police Raid Animal Liberation Radical Safe House" or something like that. It was like this very sensational title. And when you read the article, you got the impression that the police, through their investigative, techniques and their savvy and their genius, had figured out that we were living in this house and staged this big raid of the house. The fact is that a cop on that town was doing a routine check of the house and noticed there was a light on inside this house that was supposed to be abandoned. That's all it was. Now, if you read any of these articles in the newspaper, you would get the impression that the police were very good at their investigative work and had sort of like staged this like stakeout and raid of the house. And it's really interesting being on like the inside of cases and then seeing how they're portrayed in the media, because the police will always try to make it seem like this was part of some sort of like that whatever happens is the product of their investigative ability, and that's almost never the case. When I got arrested many years later, I got arrested at a Starbucks, like trying to shoplift some CDs. That was like why I got arrested. But if you actually read the articles, they made it sound like they had me under surveillance, which is totally not true. So this is the kind of thing like we see time and time again, where they try to spin dumb luck and make it look like it's their investigative savvy. And so again, it's an example of repression that is not quite as scary when you see it close up, because you realize most of what they accomplished through dumb luck. So shortly after that, maybe shortly, it was actually a couple years, I got charged with extortion for raiding fur farms and releasing mink. Now, this is an example. This is the one example I'm going to give of something that is actually very serious. They took something that I thought I would get 2 or 3 years in prison for, and took an existing law and twisted it to fit to releasing animals from a farm, which had never been done in the history of the legal system in the US, and turned it into something that I was probably going to get 12 years in prison for. Now, this is an example of actual repression versus sort of like the perceived repression. And there's nothing really positive I could say about this. This can happen to people. This happened to people in this room. Things they thought were legal or they thought would only get them a certain amount of time. Laws get twisted and they end up getting massively larger amount of time. And like I said, there's really no empowering spin I could put on this. It can happen. It's rare, but it does happen. The only sort of positive spin I could put on it is that ultimately they were not successful in that, and I did not serve the time that they thought I would, and those charges were dropped. So another form of repression, although it was my own choice, was to become a fugitive, and I went on the run, like I said earlier, for about 8 years, and that was a choice I made. It was a choice I felt I had to make because at the time I believed I was going to serve a potential life sentence. I didn't really know that that's not exactly a realistic threat, but I didn't know that at the time, so I chose to go on the run, and I felt like that was the only choice I could make. And again, it was a choice, but it was still a form of repression. I got sort of pulled out of my activist work and forced underground. And being a fugitive is actually kind of fun. Like you get to live under a fake name. Like you have an excuse to not talk to like all those relatives you probably don't like that much. And so there's some good things about it, it really wasn't that hard. I think the 2 rules of being a fugitive is just getting an ID under a fake name, number 1, and number 2 is don't call your parents. If you can do those 2 things, you're probably going to be all right as a fugitive. So I was able to do that for a long while, and that actually did cause me a lot of hardship, and it was a very serious thing, but it was also a choice that I made. So I think the next thing that happened was my co-defendant got arrested. He was not as good as being a fugitive as I was. He got arrested pretty quick, and he also ended up testifying against me to a grand jury, and then agreed to testify against me in court. So Now, at the time, my illusion was that if we're activists, then we are rock solid, we are never going to break, we're willing to die for this. And that's how I thought everybody was. Well, my co-defendant, he broke under a very light amount of pressure. So this was a very big wake-up call to me. But I like the quote that I heard once that goes, the trust that functions best is that which is tested least. And I wish I'd known that at the time, because I wish I would have sort of thought of ways to do the things, the illegal things that me and him did together. In this case, it was release animals from fur farms. I would have sort of thought about ways to, if I wanted to do something like that, how to do it by myself, how to work alone. And that was something I never thought of before, because all the time that I was an activist, I would read this literature, like ALF literature, and it would always say, okay, here's what you do. You find between 1 and 4 other people, like you form a cell, and then you go out and you break the law for animals. The one thing they never said was that you can work alone. And I wish somebody had given me this idea, because I just took what I had read as like the rules that you had to work with somebody else. And when I go back and think about it, I could have done probably just as much working by myself and with none of the risk, or I shouldn't say none of the risk, but much, much less risk. So that was a lesson there, is every instance that you can, if it's a situation that could be legally compromising, work alone. Then I got sent to prison, and that's kind of the ultimate form of repression. It's they having your freedom taken away. Other than getting killed, I suppose that would be the ultimate form of repression. And there's a lot I could say about prison. I don't really like to talk about it that much. There's a lot of stories I could tell, but the one thing I can say that I feel obligated to say is that I had in my head an image of what prison was, and when I finally got there, I was like, man, this is what I've been afraid of. Like, this is nothing. It's not. I shouldn't say it's nothing. There's a tremendous amount of hardship that comes from being in prison. But the day-to-day reality at the prison I was at was that it's like a lot of like guys with neck tattoos and like slippers sitting around like watching wrestling. Like that was pretty much like how I spent my 2 years. And what was most like I guess shocking to me, or what I least expected, was that although there is violence in prison, in my experience, at least at the prison I was at, I found almost all of it to be avoidable. Like if you didn't get into debt through gambling, you didn't get involved in gangs, you didn't get involved in drugs, you could pretty much safely bet you could escape like 95% of the violence. Now there could be riots, like things could happen, and some of it's unavoidable, but I found that form of repression, what I considered to be the ultimate form of repression, was actually not even 10% as bad as I thought it would be. And so anyway, I felt like that's something I wish somebody had told me many years ago. Because what they don't really tell you is when you read a book about prison, or you see like a TV show about prison, and they splice together like all these like clips of like people getting stabbed and stuff, and like that stuff happens, but they're taking possibly years of footage and breaking it down into like 30 minutes. Or like you read a book and like it's someone telling like the craziest stories from like their 7-year prison sentence and putting it into 30 pages. But at least in my head, the way I always interpreted that is like, this is the stuff that happens like every single day. And I don't like to fight, so I was a little intimidated by that prospect. So I got when I got arrested, one of the things that happened immediately is that how are we doing on time? I'm sorry, I just want to 15. Okay. Do people in Europe read this book called Catcher in the Rye? Do people know what this book is? Okay, all right. I haven't told this story in a while. It's not terribly interesting, but when I got arrested, they were absolutely obsessed with figuring out like who I knew when I was on the run. And this is another kind of repression that we see, and they don't really have to investigate too much anymore, because now we have Facebook, so they know who everybody else knows. But when I got arrested, MySpace was like still kind of like, MySpace.com was still kind of like coming up, and so they were really interested in trying to figure out like who I knew and how they knew each other, and like who like hid me out when I was a fugitive and all that stuff. So this was like a major focus of their investigation, was like, who did I know when I was on the run? So when I when I got arrested, I had a piece of paper on me that was like a quote that my friend had written me from the book Catcher in the Rye. And this person like signed the quote Holden Caulfield. If anyone remembers, this was like the character in Catcher in the Rye, and like put it in my pocket. And I don't think I even ever saw it. But when I got arrested, they found this quote, and they were like, "Okay, we got somebody. This is Peter's friend named Holden Caulfield, and we got to find this guy." And so they went through their databases and they did this like search, and they actually found Holden Caulfield. He lives in Prescott, Arizona. I swear to God. So like some poor old man with an unfortunate name got a knock at his door saying like, "How do you know Peter Young? Like, what are you doing hiding him out?" And this was actually quite a real like serious thing for me when I was in prison, like not really knowing like whose door they were breaking down and what friends I had that they knew of and what they might say. But one of the things that I learned, and this is an important lesson, is to educate your friends. And you know, anyone around you, if you're like dating somebody maybe who's not so educated about like security culture or the movement, you know, you don't want to freak them out, but you know, have a conversation with them about how to deal with police. And I felt like I had actually done that. You know, like I had, when I was on the run, like nobody knew that I was a fugitive. Like my girlfriend, like nobody. So, but I always had this talk with them that it probably seemed a little bit like suspicious to them, but I would just say like, "Hey, listen, if the cops ever come, like, you know, and so I would like, or I just like leave like literature around, you know, so they'd find, it was actually very useful because there were a lot of people who had no activist history that were in my life who still knew not to talk to the police and refused to when the police came around. So, you know, in fact, I actually found oftentimes that my non-activist friends were actually better at dealing with cops than my activist friends. I don't know how that works, but there's something weird about like psychologically about like the more you talk about something, like the worse you are at it or something. It's almost like you're trying to overcompensate. I don't really know how that works, but but you know, some people did talk to the police, and there's you know, they violated that code that you don't talk to the police about your friends, and that did happen to me on a couple of occasions. And you know, you should never talk to those people again. Like I shut them out. I'll never talk to them again. And you know, anyone in your life, if they talk to the police about you, that's like the ultimate crime in my world. Like you should never talk to somebody like that ever again, because they're dangerous. And then when I got arrested, there was somebody who was doing jail support for me who they like thought was a friend of mine when I was on the run, which wasn't true, but this was their theory. So they were like following her, like literally the FBI was following her from jail to where she went. And so she decided to sort of try to run a yellow light. Do they have yellow lights in Europe? I'm sorry. You know when the light's about to turn red? Is this an American thing? Okay, I'm sorry. Forgive me, I'm new to the continent. So she ran a yellow light trying to evade the FBI, and the FBI decided to run the red light, what was then a red light, and she looked in her rearview mirror and saw a FBI car smashed into another car and got into an accident. But I hope you see the pattern emerging here of just like Keystone. Oh, I can't say Keystone Cops, like stupid cops. And just like bumbling fools most of the time. Occasionally they do stuff that's kind of clever, but I hope you see the image emerging. It's like the stuff is never again as scary close up as it is from a distance.
Peter,
so
when you want to do Q&A, we should stop.
Oh, am I out of time? Oh my gosh. Okay. Are we close to the 50-minute mark or the 30-minute mark?
We're close to the 50-minute mark.
I did not know that. Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, I had a ton more to talk about, so I guess we should do Q&A. I'm going to spend 2 more minutes and talk really quickly about a couple of things. I'll skip the whole prison thing entirely. When I got out of prison, things got really interesting as far as like the repression stuff. I had my trash taken. We had the like garbage men show up at our door one day and just say like, "Hey, why do you take the trash cans out to the curb every Thursday, but they're always empty?" And we're like, "Oh, wait a minute. The FBI," it's because the FBI comes at 4 a.m. and takes the trash from the trash cans. I had countless examples of this happen when I got out of prison. I had my house raided on 2 occasions. I had a storage unit searched secretly, and I know this because the laptops that I had in there whose batteries were dead were suddenly fully charged when I went back. That's a true story. I got in a fight with my ex-girlfriend once over text message, and they were at her house the next morning trying to capitalize on the dispute. And this stuff happens. And then there's a whole bunch more I wanted to go into. Anyone can talk to me afterwards. But there was a case where I was at a conference like this, and a woman came up and approached me, and she's very friendly, and she wanted to hang out. And so we talked a little bit, and then it turns out she ended up taking me on a vacation to southern Utah, which she paid for, and on the weekend vacation. And as I come to find out later, she was working for the FBI. So that is a long story, just like most of my stories. But I'll just give you 3 points to leave you with, and this is my whole message in my talk. One is, identify that cop in your head and kill that cop. Don't let that cop disempower you. Keep your focus on the animals. That's the most important thing. Don't get distracted by the repression issue. Only if it's a legitimate concern should you give it attention, not if it's just a perceived concern. And nothing's ever as scary close up as it is from a distance. If you actually one of the rare people who experiences actual government repression, who knows? You could get a free vacation to Utah out of it. Who knows? So, okay. Anyway, that's all I got. Thank you. So, how much?
Thank you.
Yes. Are we all done? No time?
No, we have time, like 10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay, cool. So if anyone has questions.
Well, you talked just a bit about Facebook and so, and even if a lot of individuals don't have to fear repression directly and so, I think it's a good way to have some security culture, like you told, and perhaps not. I don't know if we have not to use Facebook at all, or in some occasion, like, it's a complicated question, but trying to build for me a security culture in the whole movement. To protect ourselves, but others perhaps some people I met was doing some stuff and so, and there is a lot of connection analysis in different social movements and so. So I think it's better well to. Not to facilitate. I don't want to work for the police free. Otherwise I would be policeman. So that's all.
Okay. Yeah, I think I got your point. I didn't mean to sort of make like a wholesale condemnation of Facebook. I use Facebook, and it's something to be aware of.
Yeah, so since there are so many questions, would you tell us a little bit more about the post-prison repression that you said that there were?
Yeah, I mean, I could just real quick, I feel bad I had to kind of skim over that. I'm bad with my time, but there was, I was definitely a marked man when I got out of prison. It's not because I'm important. It's just really that there's very few people who, in terms of Animal Liberation Front activity, that you can put a name and face to. So I think they just sort of were obligated to sort of follow me around because they didn't really have very many names they could sort of put to this stuff. So at least in the U.S. So there was a whole lot of we caught them following us on multiple occasions, especially when I got out of prison. When I got out of prison, people put together a party for me, like a get out of prison party or whatever. And there was strangely there were 3 people that flew out from Philadelphia. And 2 of whom were known activists that just wanted to come out and whatever. One of them I'd never met before. And as it turns out, when the activists were going back to Philadelphia at the airport, the person behind the counter at the airline referred to this 3rd woman as a name that was foreign to the 2 people that she was with, who she had both known for a couple of years. As it turns out, she got confronted about this inconsistency, and she admitted to working for a private intelligence firm. And she had flown out to my party. which I feel like there should be a Geneva Convention for like, you know, spying. Like you don't go to like parties. Like that's not that shouldn't be allowed. Yeah, I don't know what you learned from that. Like, you know, like what kind of music eco-terrorists dance to. I don't know, but so yeah, I could go on. I'd probably fill up another hour about all of that. I had my house raided on a couple of occasions, and the police like when they were leaving the second time, they were like super tough, and they're like, you know, and there's, you know, we got all your stuff, and they back out and they like run into a pole and like destroy their car, like right in front of my house. It was awesome. Yeah, so there's a whole lot of that. Yeah, the story about the FBI woman who took me to Utah is very long and crazy. So anyway, I'm sorry. Another one. Questions if there's any more.
No, scream if I don't see you. Back here.
Mine is really quick. Will you do all over again if you know you were going to go to jail?
Would I do it over again if I knew I was going to go to jail? That's a dangerous question to answer. I will not do it again, but I would do it again. Yes? Does that make sense? You know, there's certain things I might have done differently. I probably could have turned myself in like 2 years before when I did, because the reason I got a light sentence was this like Supreme Court ruling that happened in like 2004, and I got arrested in 2005 or something. So like, you know, I could have gotten the same result if I turned myself in a little bit early. So, but altogether, you know, no regrets.
There was another question here in this row.
Yeah, not a question, but only a short notice. I'm very glad you decided to do your talk, because I think that, yeah, as you said, it's maybe fashionable to that everybody is asking about repression, and it's important to demystify the fear, and I think that's exactly what you did here, so that people are not afraid to speak up and maybe go to jail or face repression. That's shouldn't be something we should fear. So that's the reason why it's important to speak about it like this.
Yeah, that's exactly, you know, the point I was trying to make. And like, you know, we cannot say this is like the greatest fight in the history of the world, which it is, and then say, oh, but a weekend in jail? No, I can't. We can't do that. We have to be consistently with how serious. We have to act consistently with how serious this issue is and what we're fighting for. So, exactly.
No more questions? Then thank you very much.
Okay.
No? Oh, stop. I haven't seen. Where? There, okay.
You said just put a cop out of your head, but pay attention only with the legitimate case. But what do you mean with pay attention with the legitimate case exactly?
I'm sorry. I think I might have missed your question exactly.
No, I think you said put a cop out of your head,
right?
But only pay attention with some legitimate cases.
Right.
But what do you mean with this legitimate cases?
Okay, so
you have to pay attention.
Yeah. So what do I mean about like legitimate cases of repression? It's a very difficult conversation to have, because first of all, I have to be very careful not to diminish like actual repression. People in this room have experienced it. It's real. You can't say it's not real. So I guess the question is like, how do you know? I think most of the time, if you know if you know what you're doing might actually get you sent to prison. Not always, but one measure, if you're doing something legal but it's highly effective. If I was doing something that I believe to be entirely 100% illegal, even if lawyers told me it was legal, but if it was very effective and a threat to animal abusers, I would consider myself a likely target. And that in of itself can be a sort of fear-generating comment, and I hate for that to be the case, but history has shown if they don't have laws to put people who are effective in prison, they'll twist existing laws to put those people in prison, or they will make up new laws to put those people in prison. And it should no way be a deterrent, but that is sort of the sober reality. So I hate to leave on that note, Jesus, but okay. Thank you. Yeah.